They sold her for less than the price of a broken engine coil. No one looked twice. No one asked her name. To the traders in that rusted auction hall on the edge of the galaxy, she was just another forgotten body, from a forgotten race, a quiet Zarini girl with hollow eyes and nothing to offer but her silence. The chains around her wrists weren't even necessary anymore. She had stopped fighting long ago. But in a room full of people who saw her as nothing, one man raised his hand and everything changed. He didn't look like a hero. He didn't shout, or threaten, or break the chains. He just paid for her with barely a word, then walked away without ever turning back. And in that single moment, Rhea faced the most terrifying question of her life. Not what will he do to me? But, what if he does nothing at all? What if, for the first time in her life, no one tried to own her? What if freedom was real and she had no idea how to live it? This isn't a story about rescue. This is a story about choosing to fight when no one is forcing you to. A story about humanity not as dominance, but as defiance. The air inside the Antellan Trade Hub's auction hall reeked of desperation. It clung to the skin like sweat and smoke, a cocktail of old alcohol, engine fuel, and the sour stench of too many unwashed bodies packed too close together. Dim red lights flickered overhead, casting long, twitching shadows across rows of rusted benches and metallic scaffolding. The buzz of low voices filled the space: merchants, slavers, gamblers, scavengers. Some shouted half-hearted bids, others haggled over crates of spare parts or cheap stimulants, but most were just waiting for something interesting to appear on the stage. Rhea knew she was not that something. She stood barefoot on the auction platform, arms crossed tightly over her thin chest, trying to make herself smaller than she already was. The cold metal beneath her feet bit into her skin. The restraints on her wrists weren't even necessary anymore. She hadn't tried to resist in weeks. Resistance was for those who still believed there was something left to fight for. She'd stopped believing a long time ago. Her skin, a soft hue of cerulean, shimmered faintly under the lights once considered beautiful among her people, back when her people still had a world. Now, it was just another feature that made her look strange, unwanted, unimportant. The Zarini hadn't been numerous in decades, and those who survived the planetary collapse had scattered like stardust, vanishing into mining colonies, labor camps, the underbellies of orbital stations. Rhea was one of the unlucky few who'd been caught and traded so many times she'd lost track of how many names she'd been given. How many owners she'd been forced to obey. The worst part was how normal it had all started to feel. She heard the slaver to her right yawn as he scrolled through a data pad, not even pretending to pitch her to the crowd. She wasn't worth the effort. She wasn't exotic enough for collectors, strong enough for labor buyers, or appealing enough for darker trades. Just a skinny, quiet Zarini girl whose species hadn't mattered in years. "Start the bid at 100, the slaver muttered. No one looked up. "Not really." 75, someone chuckled from the back. 50. The crowd laughed. Rhea kept her gaze down. It didn't sting anymore. That part of her had gone numb. This wasn't the first auction she'd been through. But something about this one felt heavier. More final. Like a door she hadn't realized was still cracked open was finally closing. A few more half-hearted voices tossed numbers into the air. No one really cared. The audience was more interested in the cybernetically enhanced Graven Brute scheduled to appear next. He could rip a man in half. She couldn't even make eye contact without flinching. The room blurred at the edges of her vision. The heat, the noise, the pressure of so many people looking and not seeing it all swirled into a fog. She felt the chain tug slightly as the slaver shifted, but she didn't move. Didn't speak. She had learned the lesson long ago: silence was safer. Silence kept you alive, even if it also kept you invisible. A voice rose above the murmurs. Not loud, not aggressive. Just clear. 1000. Silence followed. Not the kind she'd built around herself, but the heavy, stunned silence of everyone else. Her head turned before she could stop it. It was him. A human, standing at the back of the room. Not dressed like a noble or a merchant, but not like a vagrant either. His armor was scratched, dulled by time and use. A sidearm hung casually at his hip. His posture was relaxed, one shoulder leaning against a rusted support beam as if he had all the time in the world. But there was tension in his frame. Control. Purpose. She had seen a lot of faces in her life. Faces of buyers, dealers, guards. Faces that wanted things. His face didn't want anything. It just was. The crowd murmured again. Confused. Amused. Suspicious. Even the slaver blinked, uncertain whether to be thrilled or annoyed by the sudden spike in price. Thousands too much for that one, someone muttered. She ain't worth half that. The human didn't react. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't look at them. He looked at her. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Rhea felt seen. Not assessed. Not evaluated. Just seen. She wasn't sure how to process that. Sold, the auctioneer barked, eager to move on. The moment snapped. The slaver detached her restraints and shoved a worn tunic into her hands without looking up from the credit sheet he'd just received. She stumbled slightly, her legs weak, heart pounding in her chest. She expected the usual, a harsh voice, a grip on her arm, the first set of commands. But he didn't grab her. The human just turned toward the exit and gave a small nod over his shoulder. Come on. That was it. No chain. No collar. No leash. Just an open door. She stared after him for a second too long, waiting for the trap, the punishment, the laughter that always followed hope. It didn't come. So she moved. Because in that moment, when no one else bid, no one else cared, when she had been reduced to a line on a ledger worth less than a used data drive, someone had seen her, and chosen her anyway. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something she hadn't dared to imagine in years. A future. Not as property, but as a person. He didn't look like a hero. Not that Rhea would have known what one looked like. Heroes didn't show up at slave auctions, and if they did, they certainly didn't bid. They led revolts. They shot slavers in the head. They burned down cages. But this man, he didn't carry fire or fury. He carried silence. When he stepped forward from the shadowed back row, no one noticed him at first. He wasn't flashy. He didn't wear high-cast colors or polished boots. His armor was worn, the kind used by people who couldn't afford replacements but knew how to make things last. His sidearm looked like it had seen more battles than breaks. There was a knife at his belt, too simple, sharp, utilitarian. Not for show. For survival. The only part of him that was striking was his stillness. The auctioneer had been droning through the next item. Lot 273. Female. Zarini. Low threat level. Untrained. Unclaimed. The words blurred together in the stale air, just another body on the block. Rhea barely heard it. She was still on autopilot, staring at a crack in the floor beneath her bare feet, trying not to exist too loudly. And then his voice cut through everything. 1000. Just 2 words. Calm. Unemotional. Almost bored. But the moment they dropped, the room changed. The jeering stopped. The drunken slavers blinked. The auctioneer choked on his own speech. Even the datapads paused in mid-scroll. Rhea looked up. She didn't mean to. She didn't want to. But something in her instincts, the ones that had kept her alive this long, snapped to attention. Her eyes found him at the edge of the crowd, and in that instant, she understood something very dangerous. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't there to gawk. He wasn't there for a thrill or a prize. He wasn't there because he needed a servant, or a toy, or a body. He was there because he had already decided. And for reasons Rhea couldn't understand, that decision involved her. The murmurs began again. She's not worth that. What's the angle? He must be drunk. But the man didn't flinch. Didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The slaver, momentarily thrown off, looked from the crowd to the datapad, then back at the man. Confirmed, the auctioneer said with a shrug. Sold. Just like that. As if her entire life could be transferred with a single transaction. As if 1,000 credits had bought not just her body but every scar, every memory, every year stolen from her. Rhea's heart pounded, though she didn't know why. This was no different from the others. Was it? Except it was. Because when the chains were unlocked, and the slaver shoved a worn tunic into her hands, the man who bought her didn't come forward to collect his prize. He simply turned toward the exit and said, over his shoulder, "Come on." She froze. That was it? No leash? No threats? No shove to make her move? He didn't even look back to see if she followed. He just walked. Rhea stared after him, brain struggling to process. She should run. She should stay. She should drop to the ground and scream or disappear or do something, anything, because this didn't make sense. Slavers didn't walk away. Buyers didn't offer space. And yet here was the stranger, not just letting her decide whether or not to follow, but expecting her to. It felt like a test. No, it felt like something far more dangerous. It felt like freedom. Her legs moved before her mind did. Instinct. Survival. Or maybe something older, deeper, something that hadn't dared breathe in years. She slipped off the stage, ignored the glares and laughter, and walked after him. He didn't speak until they reached the ship. It sat in docking bay C4, nestled between 2 freighters and covered in scarring from old battles. Not sleek, not pretty, but solid. Its matte black hull carried no official markings, just a name painted near the hatch in faded white. The Iron Raven. He paused at the bottom of the ramp and turned toward her, hands tucked into the pockets of his worn jacket. You hungry? The question hit harder than she expected. Of all the things he could have asked, her name, her skills, her obedience, that's what he chose. She didn't answer. He didn't push. He just jerked his chin toward the open hatch and walked inside. She stood there a moment longer, heart thudding like it had when she was small and afraid of shadows. The difference was, this time, the shadow had offered her a door and left it open. She followed. Inside, the ship was quiet. Lived in, but not neglected. The scent of engine grease mixed with something faintly clean, like someone had tried to scrub away the past, but traces still clung to the corners. The corridor lights were dim but steady. The hum beneath her feet reminded her of a heartbeat. Alive. Moving. Real. He led her to a small common room with a bolted table and storage bins lining the wall. No security cams. No collars. No other crew. Just him. He tossed a ration pack onto the table. Not gourmet, he said. But it won't kill you. Still no demands. No orders. No questions. Just choices. She sat down slowly. Peeled open the pack. Took a bite. It tasted like cardboard, but it was warm. He didn't sit across from her. Just leaned against the wall, arms crossed, studying her not like a possession, but like a puzzle. Finally, she looked up. Why? She asked. Why did you buy me? He met her eyes. No hesitation. No smile. I didn't like the other bidders. That was all he said. And somehow, in the space between those 5 words, Rhea felt something shift. It wasn't love. It wasn't salvation. It was the beginning of something she hadn't felt in years. Possibility. And maybe just maybe a future she could choose for herself. The Iron Raven was nothing like the ships Rhea had seen in the hands of slavers, syndicates, or state fleets. It wasn't gleaming or opulent, didn't shimmer with excess or buzz with artificial luxury. There were no servants stationed at the hatch, no sterile corridors scrubbed of personality. The hull was a dull, matte black, marked with burn scars and small patches of plating where someone had clearly repaired battle damage themselves, not because they had to keep up appearances, but because they wanted the ship to fly again. It didn't look like a ship that owned anyone. It looked like a ship that had seen too much and survived anyway. Rhea stood at the base of the ramp for a moment, unsure. She wasn't waiting for permission. That was what surprised her. He'd already walked ahead, giving her space to follow or not. No leash. No threat. Just an open path and the quiet understanding that if she wanted to leave, now was her chance. The quiet was unnerving. She wasn't used to silence that didn't feel dangerous. She stepped forward. The metal ramp creaked beneath her bare feet as she moved inside, her arms still wrapped tightly around herself, as if she could armor her ribs with bone and fear. The ship's interior was dimly lit with amber panels lining the floor and ceiling, flickering faintly but not enough to suggest failure just where. The air smelled of metal, engine grease, and something vaguely earthy, like someone had once brewed real coffee there and the memory of it had soaked into the walls. He didn't turn around to check if she was following. He simply moved, unhurried, down the main corridor. She trailed behind him, scanning everything. There were no security doors. No surveillance systems glaring down from the corners. Just maintenance panels, exposed wiring in places, and handwritten notes taped to a control panel near a junction pipe. Whoever flew this ship didn't believe in perfection. Just function. And maybe familiarity. He led her into what looked like a mess hall, though calling it a hall was generous. It was a room just big enough for a table bolted to the floor and a few mismatched chairs. Some had broken legs that had been welded back together, some were different heights entirely. A wall panel had been removed and left leaning against the corner, half a circuit exposed. This wasn't a ship curated for guests. It was a ship lived in. Without ceremony, he walked to a storage bin, opened it, pulled out a ration pack, and tossed it onto the table. Not much, he said. But it's hot. Eat if you want. She hesitated. Hunger gnawed at her, but she didn't move immediately. She was used to food being conditional, something to be earned, something withheld, something used as leverage. The absence of terms made her nervous. Still, after a few seconds, she stepped forward, sat, and opened the pack. It was bland and rubbery, but it was real. And warm. He didn't sit. Just leaned against the far wall, watching her, not with suspicion, not with hunger. With curiosity. Like he was still trying to figure out who she was, what to make of her. That alone made her uncomfortable. She kept her head down. "This ship," she started, then paused, not sure why she was speaking. "It doesn't feel like a prison." He didn't smile. He rarely did. But something in his face softened. "It's not." A beat passed. "I've lived in ships that were," she said quietly. "They had walls that were too clean. Too white. Too cold." He nodded once. "I know the kind." Silence fell between them again. But it wasn't suffocating. It felt like space. Like air. After she ate, he gestured toward the corridor behind him. "Come on. I'll show you where you can sleep." She followed again, her step slow but steady. Her body still expected a hand at her back, shoving her forward. It never came. He brought her to a small berth near the middle of the ship. It wasn't locked. The door was manual, no keypad, no biometric access. Just a sliding hatch and a narrow cot with a folded blanket on top. There was a storage unit in the corner and a vent humming faintly above the ceiling. "You can use this room," he said. "No one else on board, so it's yours." She blinked. "You don't have a crew?" He shook his head. "Not anymore." She didn't ask why. "Not yet." When he turned to leave, she spoke again. "What do you expect from me?" He paused in the doorway. "Nothing." The word dropped like a weight. It rang in the air, too simple, too quiet to feel true. She stepped forward. "You didn't pay 1,000 credits for nothing." Now he looked at her fully. His gaze steady, unflinching, but not hard. "I paid to stop someone else from owning you. That's not the same as saving me." "No," he said. "It's not." She stared at him, trying to parse the contradiction. "But you're here now. That's your call." And then he left. She sat on the edge of the cot for a long time after he was gone. The room didn't hum like the cells she'd known. It didn't buzz with surveillance. There were no collars hanging from the walls, no numbered plates, no cruel reminders of where she ranked. There was just space. And a blanket. And silence. She crawled beneath the covers, her eyes open wide in the dark. Sleep didn't come easily. Her body remained tense. Her thoughts raced. But in that small berth, aboard a ship held together by patched metal and quiet hands, for the first time in years, she wasn't chained. She wasn't locked in. She wasn't expected to obey. She was simply here. And somehow, that felt more terrifying and more powerful than any cage she had ever known. Because now, everything that came next, might finally be her decision. The first time Derek handed her a weapon, Rya flinched. It wasn't fear of the blade itself. It was the familiarity. The weight of it in her hand was something she recognized too well. A knife wasn't foreign to her. She had used sharp objects before, not in defense but in desperation. The kind of fights where the goal wasn't to win, only to hurt enough to get away. Her hands remembered the feel of cold steel, the sting of blood. the trembling relief that came with surviving one more day. But this was different. This time, she wasn't fighting for her life. Not exactly. She stood in the Iron Raven's training bay, a compact space near the rear of the ship. It wasn't fancy, but it was functional. The floors were reinforced. The walls were lined with weapon racks, padded mats, and scuffed targets. There were a few sparring dummies, powered down for now, and a scent in the air that was equal parts sweat and machine oil. This was where real fighters trained. Not slaves. Not cargo. Fighters. And Derek, he was watching her. Not like an opponent. Not like a teacher, either. More like a mirror. Waiting to see what would reflect back at him. He tossed the training blade toward her. She caught it, barely. "Let's see what you've got," he said. She stared at him, unsure if this was a trick. A test. A game. He stood a few feet away, unarmed. Relaxed. But Rhea had already learned something important about Derek. His calm was not weakness. It was discipline. She lunged. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't planned. It was the same kind of movement that had gotten her through alley fights and lockdown riots. Fast, reckless, full of survival instinct. Derek stepped aside with barely a shift in his weight. His hand moved like lightning. One moment the knife was in her grip, and the next, it clattered across the floor behind her. He hadn't even hurt her. Just disarmed her like he'd done it 1,000 times before. "Lesson 1, he said, voice low. "Holding a weapon doesn't mean you know how to use it." Her chest heaved, but not from exertion. From shame. And rage. Not at him, at herself. She bent down, picked up the knife, and said nothing. Again. She attacked more cautiously this time, adjusting her stance, watching his feet. But still, he outmaneuvered her easily. He wasn't taunting her. He wasn't cruel. That made it worse. She would have preferred mockery, anything to give her an excuse to snap. But Derek was just patient. He knocked the blade from her hand again and nodded once. "Better. But you're still reacting. You're not thinking ahead." She gritted her teeth. "I'm trying." He looked at her, not unkindly. "You fight like someone who expects to lose." The words hit her harder than any blow. Because they were true. That was how she had survived. By assuming she'd already lost, and doing whatever it took to escape with what little was left of her. But now, maybe it wasn't enough anymore. She tightened her grip on the knife, repositioned her feet, and squared her shoulders. "Then teach me how not to." Derek gave her a single nod. It wasn't approval. It wasn't encouragement. It was permission. And maybe that was all she'd ever wanted. Over the next few days, the lessons became a rhythm. Not a schedule. Derek didn't believe in fixed routines but a pattern. Every few hours, when the ship was on autopilot or between supply runs, he would gesture toward the training bay. And she would follow. No commands. No ranks. Just two people in a room full of controlled violence and quiet understanding. He never went easy on her. And she didn't want him to. He taught her how to read stances, how to use her size to her advantage, how to strike fast and pull back before overcommitting. He showed her how to breathe with her movements, not against them. How to fall without breaking. How to move without announcing herself. It wasn't just muscle memory. It was awareness. It was presence. It was control. She started to feel it not in the way her body stopped flinching, but in how her mind started planning. She wasn't just reacting. She was choosing. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult drill, she dropped to the mat, breathless and soaked in sweat. Her shoulders ached. Her wrists were raw. Her legs burned. Derek stood across from her, arms crossed, nodding. "You're learning." She looked up at him, hair clinging to her face, chest heaving. "You mean I didn't embarrass myself?" A flicker of a smile tugged at his lips. "You didn't give up. That's what matters." She looked at her hands, still gripping the practice blade. "When does it stop feeling like survival?" He didn't answer right away. He walked over, crouched beside her, and met her gaze directly. "It stops when you start believing you deserve more than just surviving." She blinked, startled by the softness in his voice. "And do you?" Derek's expression darkened not with anger, but with memory. "I'm still figuring that out." For a moment, they sat in silence. No training, no guards, no war. Just two people, bruised in different ways, trying to relearn what it meant to exist without fear. Later, in her room, Rhea stared at the reflection of herself in the small mirror Derek had installed. Her skin was still pale from malnutrition. Her eyes still shadowed. But something about her posture had changed. Her back was straighter. Her jaw was set. Her arms had definition now, not from punishment, but practice. She didn't look like prey anymore. She didn't feel like one either. Not because someone had saved her, but because, for the first time in her life, someone had shown her how to stand and let her decide whether to rise. And she had. The alarm hit her like a slap. Not just because of the volume, though it was sharp, shrill, meant to wake even the dead, but because of what it meant. Rhea jerked upright in her cot, heart pounding against her ribs. She was already on her feet before her mind caught up. For a split second, she wasn't on the Iron Raven anymore. She was back in the black market cargo hold of a slaver ship, red lights flashing, voices screaming in unfamiliar tongues. Her body moved on instinct, ready to run, to hide, to disappear into the smallest shadow she could find. Then Derek's voice came through the intercom. Calm, but tight. Focused. "Rhea. Cockpit. Now." She froze. Not a command. Not a threat. Just a call. One that assumed she was capable. That she could help. That she wasn't baggage to be stored, but someone who belonged. Her fear didn't vanish, but it shifted. She grabbed her boots, shoved them on quickly, and sprinted through the corridor. The ship was shaking now, not violently but in that subtle, unnerving way that suggested pressure building in the hull. Impacts. Rumbles. The low hum of shields absorbing incoming fire. When she burst into the cockpit, Derek was already at the controls, strapped in, jaw set, eyes flicking across the monitors. "Pirate frigate just dropped out of warp," he said without looking at her. "Looks like they've been tracking us since Bastion." She swallowed hard. Bastion was the last supply stop. Quiet, remote, barely patrolled. It had looked safe. How many? Small crew, probably. Fast. "They're not trying to blow us out of the sky. They want the ship." She didn't need to ask what that meant. Pirates didn't just take cargo. They took everything: tech, supplies, power cores, and people. Especially people. "Are we outgunned?" "Completely," he said. Then added, but not outmatched. The ship rocked again, harder this time. She stumbled forward, catching herself on the edge of the console. Derek glanced at her for the first time. "You with me?" She nodded, trying to ignore the tremor in her hands. He motioned toward the weapons bay. "Second locker on the left. Get the rifle. Bring it back here." She didn't hesitate. She ran. The weapons bay was darker than usual, the overhead lights flickering under the strain of redirected power. She found a locker, yanked it open, grabbed the rifle, a sleek, compact plasma model. It was heavier than she remembered. Her fingers wrapped around the grip, knuckles white. She paused for half a second before returning. This time, she didn't run because she was afraid. She ran because she had a role to play. Back in the cockpit, she handed the rifle to Derek. He checked the charge, nodded, then laid it beside the co-pilot's seat. He pointed to the harness. "Strap in. They're going to try and dock." The buckle clicked shut across her chest. She looked at the stars through the viewport. The enemy ship was closer now, its silhouette sleek and predatory against the void. Its weapons weren't firing anymore. That was worse. That meant they were preparing for boarding. "What do we do?" she asked, voice low. Derek leaned forward, typing something into the NAV panel. His hands were steady. "We make them think we're already dead." She blinked. "What?" "Trust me." He killed the engines. In an instant, the ship went silent. The artificial gravity flickered. The lights dimmed. The Iron Raven drifted, quiet and lifeless, like a corpse waiting to be picked clean. Her breath caught. Her instincts screamed. But she didn't move. She stayed still. Watched. Waited. The pirate vessel slowed, approaching with caution. Scanners likely probing for heat, for pulse signatures. Derek's fingers hovered above a separate control panel, manual weapons override. "Wait for it," he murmured. The seconds dragged, stretched thin by adrenaline and silence. Ria's pulse roared in her ears. Then, just as the enemy ship edged into range, Derek slammed his fist on the console. The Iron Raven came alive. Engines roared. Shields reignited. Forward cannons deployed and fired in a single breathless burst. The pirate frigate reeled back, caught off guard by the sudden assault. Its shields sparked. The hull groaned under the force of impact. Derek didn't wait for a counterattack. He spun the ship hard, flipping their position, now behind the pirate ship. He moved with precision, every motion fluid and exact, like this was just another sparring match. Only this time, the stakes were life and death. "Take the auxiliary," he snapped. Ria blinked. "What?" He motioned toward the co-pilot screen. "NAV assist. I need you to reroute auxiliary power. Shields are spiking." She didn't think. She moved. Her hands flew across the panel. The training he'd given her, basic systems, emergency responses, it came back in fragments. But it came. She rerouted the power, stabilized the forward shields, and tapped the thermal dispersal to reduce weapon overheating. "Done," she said. He glanced at the screen, then at her. "Well done." The pirate ship veered again, trying to escape now. But it was too late. Derek fired a second barrage, focused this time, aimed directly at their engine core. The detonation didn't destroy them, but it rendered them motionless. They drifted in space now. Silent. Just like the Raven had pretended to be. Derek let out a long breath, muscles easing as he pulled back from the controls. The hum of the ship settled into a quieter rhythm. "We're clear," he said. Rhea couldn't speak. Her body still buzzed with energy, her breath shallow, her hands tingling. But she hadn't panicked. She hadn't hidden. She had stayed. He turned to her fully now, his eyes searching her face. "You okay?" She nodded. Slowly. He studied her for a moment longer. Then, with a ghost of a smile, he said, "You didn't freeze. You didn't run. That counts for something." She let out a shaky laugh. "I thought I might. But you didn't." There was pride in his voice. Real pride. And it wrapped around her like armor. She'd faced fear before. Countless times. But never like this. Never in a moment where her actions had meant more than her survival. Never where standing her ground meant protecting something bigger than herself. The Iron Raven drifted forward, space opening up before them again. But Rhea didn't look out the viewport. She looked at her own hands. They were still shaking. But not from fear. From fire. And she knew, deep down, that something in her had changed forever. There was something strange about silence on the Iron Raven. It wasn't hollow. It wasn't the kind of silence Rhea had grown up fearing, the tense, unnatural kind that filled the space before a blow or a betrayal. This silence had a rhythm to it. A heartbeat. It was thick with thought and heavy with choice, but it never demanded anything from her. It just existed. And over time, she began to let herself exist inside it too. In the days after the pirate attack, nothing dramatic changed between her and Derek. There was no sudden intimacy, no grand shift in how he treated her. He didn't shower her with thanks or praise. He didn't look at her like she'd saved them both, even though part of her wanted him to. He just handed her a hot ration pack that evening and said, in his usual quiet way, "You did good." Then he turned back to the engine readouts like it had been just another day. But that small acknowledgement, that simple phrase, landed in her chest like something sacred. It wasn't praise for the sake of comfort. It was recognition. Real. Earned. She found herself sitting in the mess hall more often now. Not because she was hungry, but because it was one of the few places in the ship that didn't feel like it belonged to either of them. It was neutral ground. A table, 2 chairs, and a window that looked out into endless dark. Derek would often join her there, not saying much. Just bringing his coffee, sometimes a data pad, sometimes a maintenance tool, and sitting down across from her. They didn't talk, most of the time. But the stillness between them started to change. At first it had been filled with tension, with uncertainty. Then came the caution. But now, there was something else. A shared quiet. A kind of understanding that didn't need language to hold itself up. One night, she sat at the table tracing the rim of her mug with her thumb, eyes fixed on the stars outside. She didn't hear Derek enter, but she felt it like the temperature of the room shifted. He walked past her, his steps light, and made 2 cups of coffee without asking. He placed one in front of her without a word and leaned against the counter, sipping his own. "You sleep?" he asked after a few minutes. She shook her head. "Didn't think so," he murmured. Rhea looked down into the dark liquid. It wasn't great coffee, but it was warm. Steady. Like everything else about him. "Do you ever?" she asked. He chuckled under his breath. It was a dry sound, but not unpleasant. Enough to keep flying. She nodded. They sat in silence again. But it wasn't cold or distant. It was more like the quiet of a late night between two people who had nothing to prove to each other. She wondered, sometimes, if he ever felt alone before she came aboard. The ship didn't feel lonely, but it had an emptiness to it, like it had waited a long time to carry more than one heartbeat. She glanced at him, searching his face. The scars were more visible in the low light. Not the kind from laser burns or blade strikes. The kind people carried in their eyes, even when their bodies had healed. "Do you miss them?" she asked quietly. He looked at her. "My crew." She nodded. He let out a long breath, eyes fixed on the viewport now. "Some days. Some nights. Not every face, but the ones that mattered." "What happened?" He didn't answer immediately. His fingers tapped against the rim of his mug. "Wrong job. Wrong system. Right intentions, maybe. But we weren't prepared. I was the captain. I should have known better." The guilt in his voice was quiet, but it was there, embedded in the way he carried his shoulders, in the way his eyes never quite stopped moving, always watching, always anticipating the next hit. "They trusted me," he said. "And I got them killed." Rhea swallowed, unsure what to say. She had no words for grief like that. But something in her understood it. The feeling of being the one left behind. Of surviving when others didn't. "They chose to fly with you," she said. He looked over at her, surprised. "I don't think they would have followed a man they didn't believe in." He didn't respond. But the look in his eyes shifted. Not gratitude exactly, something quieter. A crack in the wall. She stood slowly, moved to the viewport, and leaned against the edge of the frame. "You ever wonder," she said, "if we keep running because we're afraid of what'll happen when we finally stop?" Derek joined her, setting his cup on the ledge beside hers. "Sometimes I think I'm already stopped," he said. "Just haven't told myself yet." She turned her head slightly, catching the faint outline of his profile against the stars. "You don't treat me like I'm broken." "You're not. But you saw the cracks." "I see the strength between them," he said simply. She didn't expect that. Her throat tightened. He wasn't saying it to make her feel better. He wasn't trying to win her trust. He was just speaking his truth. That night, as they stood side by side, eyes on the stars, silence settled again, but this time, it felt like safety. In the weeks that followed, nothing monumental shifted. There were no confessions, no embraces, no declarations of anything. But Rhea found herself drawn to the sound of his boots in the corridor, the way he made space for her without needing to say it. He let her sit in the cockpit when he flew. Let her touch the controls under his guidance. Let her learn. He didn't push. He didn't pull. He just stayed. And in that steadiness, she felt something begin to grow. Not dependence. Not debt. But trust. The kind of trust built in quiet hours, over bitter coffee and shared glances. The kind that doesn't ask for promises, because it's already woven into the silence. The kind that says, without needing words, "I won't walk away first." And that was a bond more powerful than any chain she'd ever worn. The secret didn't come to her in a dramatic flash. There was no ominous message, no intercepted transmission, no slip of the tongue. It came the way most truths do, quietly, unexpectedly, and at the worst possible moment. She'd been trying to fix a flickering light panel in the maintenance corridor. It had become her way of helping finding broken things and putting them right again. She wasn't trained in engineering, but Derek had shown her a few basics, and she'd picked up the rest through quiet observation. It made her feel useful, like she was part of something that needed her. She popped off the panel and saw more than just a faulty wire. Behind it, nestled in a shallow utility cavity, was an old data slate. Not one of Derek's regular devices. This was older, heavier, coated in dust and magnetic residue. Curiosity tugged at her, sharper than caution. She hesitated for a long moment, then reached in and pulled it free. No password. That was the first red flag. Derek was methodical about security. Every terminal on the ship required a passcode, and yet this hidden and unsecured invited her in. What she found inside made her feel like the floor had dropped out from under her. Transport logs. Years old. Coordinates she didn't recognize at first. Then names. Dates. Cargo manifests. Codes she'd seen before, back when she was locked in crates, tagged like livestock. Biological cargo. Humanoid. Female. Low value. Zarini. Her throat tightened. She scrolled further. There was no mistake. Derek's name was attached to multiple transfers. Not in the margins. At the center. Escort complete. Payment received. Delivery secured. No casualties. The strip. A quiet roar built behind her eyes. The kind that doesn't come from rage but from betrayal so vast it takes a moment to realize it's your own heartbeat, hammering in your chest. She sat there for minutes. Maybe longer. The ship around her felt different now. Less like home, more like a trap. Her fingers hovered over the device, half expecting it to self-destruct or vanish like a bad dream. But it didn't. It just sat there. Unapologetic. Undeniable. She didn't confront him right away. She needed time to think. To breathe. To keep from exploding into a version of herself she didn't want him to see. But the space between knowing and speaking stretched like a wire pulled too tight, trembling with tension. When she finally did speak, it wasn't planned. It happened in the mess hall. Derek had just returned from running diagnostics, shirt damp with sweat, face relaxed in that way that told her he thought everything was fine. That the bond between them was real. She was already seated, the data slate in front of her like a weapon. "You didn't tell me," she said. He paused mid-step. His gaze dropped to the slate. His face didn't twist in surprise. He didn't lie. He just stopped moving. "I was going to," he said after a long silence. "When?" Her voice was sharp, cutting through the room. "Before or after I stopped being useful to you?" He stepped closer, slowly, like she might bolt if he moved too fast. "I didn't hide it because I planned to use you. I hid it because I knew it would change everything." She stood, her fists clenched. "You were one of them. You worked for the syndicates. You moved people like they were cargo. Like I was cargo." "Yes." The word landed like a stone in water. No excuses. No denials. Her anger faltered not because it vanished, but because he wasn't fighting her on it. She almost wanted him to lie. It would have been easier. She knew how to fight liars. She didn't know how to fight honesty. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would someone like you do that? I wasn't someone like me back then." She laughed bitterly. "That's convenient." Derek sat down across from her, elbows on the table. He looked older now. Not physically, something deeper. A weight behind his eyes she hadn't seen before. I was 23. Desperate. Fresh out of the military. I needed work. Took the first job that paid enough to keep the ship flying. At first, I didn't ask questions. Cargo was cargo. And when you found out? He nodded slowly. I told myself it wasn't my job to care. That I couldn't save everyone. That I wasn't the one doing the buying. But then I made a run to a station off the edge of Horus space. The buyer came early. Brought chains. One of the girls screamed. Not loud. Just, like she already knew it wouldn't help. His voice cracked slightly. He looked down at his hands. I walked away after that. Stole my ship back. Wiped my name from every registry I could. Spent years trying to disappear from that version of myself. But you kept the slate. I kept it because forgetting is too easy. And because I wanted to remember what I'm running from. Rhea stared at him, the burn behind her eyes sharp and painful. All this time, she said, I thought you were different. That maybe, just maybe, I wasn't a burden to you. That I mattered. You do. You're just saying that because you couldn't save the last girl. No, he said, voice steady. I'm saying it because you're not her. You're stronger. You fight back. You make your own decisions. And because, whether you believe it or not, I would have chosen you. Even if I'd never seen that cargo list. Even if I didn't know what I was trying to fix in myself. She looked at him for a long time. Waiting for the catch. For the reveal that this was another manipulation, another carefully orchestrated rescue with strings. But there were no strings. There was only silence. And her choice. She stood slowly, her chest tight with too many emotions to name. I need time, she said. He nodded. Take all you need. She walked away without another word, the weight of his past pressing against her ribs like a second gravity. But deep down, something else stirred beneath the hurt. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the terrifying possibility that he had once been lost just like her and had chosen to become something else. And maybe, just maybe, that meant she could too. It wasn't a grand moment. There was no climactic conversation, no passionate confrontation, no decision made under pressure or in the heat of battle. It came quietly, like most of Rhea's most important choices did on a slow morning, with silence humming between the walls and stars idling beyond the window. She was sitting in the mess hall, staring into a half-empty mug of lukewarm coffee. The ship was still. Derek had taken the Iron Raven into drift mode to let the core cool after a long haul, so there was nothing to monitor, no systems to patch, no threat bearing down on them. Just open space and the strange stillness of not being hunted, not running, not hiding. For the first time in a long time, there was space in her chest, room to feel things she didn't know what to do with. She hadn't spoken to Derek much since she found the data slate. Since he told her the truth. It wasn't avoidance. Not exactly. It was something quieter, more cautious. Like testing the weight of her own anger, turning it over in her hands, trying to see if it still fit or if it had become something else. He hadn't pressed. He'd given her time, like he promised. And that time had carved out something unexpected inside her. Not peace. Not yet. But clarity. She didn't trust easily. That had been taken from her long ago. People had tried to buy it, steal it, force it, or break it. And Derek, he had cracked something in her. Not just with the truth about his past, but with how he'd handed it to her without flinching. No excuses. No dramatics. Just the truth, laid bare, knowing it might cost him whatever connection they'd built. That mattered. She didn't know what forgiveness was supposed to feel like. Whether it was supposed to be soft or sharp, sudden or slow. All she knew was that she hadn't left. She'd stayed. At first out of inertia. Then curiosity. And now it was something different. She looked around the mess hall. The scuffed metal table. The mismatched chairs. The faint hum of the Raven's core vibrating through the floor like a heartbeat. This ship had become something to her. Not home. Not yet. But a place where she didn't have to be anything but herself. A place that asked nothing of her but what she was willing to give. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. Heavy, deliberate, familiar. Derek stepped into the room holding his usual mug, the scent of fresh coffee drifting behind him. He nodded toward her in quiet acknowledgement and sat down across from her without a word. They sipped in silence for a while, both staring out the small viewport at the stars. It wasn't awkward. It never was anymore. The quiet between them had become a language of its own. "You're thinking loud," Derek said eventually, voice low. She gave a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Am I?" He nodded. "You get this look. Like you're running 1,000 calculations all at once." "I used to," she admitted. "Every minute. Every place I ended up in, I had to plan for the worst. Where the exits were. How to vanish if things went sideways. How to make myself small enough that no one remembered I was there." He said nothing, just waited. She took a deep breath, then exhaled slowly. "But lately, I haven't been doing that." "That's good," he said softly. "It's terrifying," she corrected. He looked at her then, really looked. She met his gaze and held it, and for the first time in days, the space between them wasn't filled with hesitation. "I think I want to stay," she said. The words hung there, vulnerable and uncertain, and yet spoken with a quiet conviction that surprised even her. Derek didn't react with relief or joy. He didn't try to thank her or make it about him. He just nodded once, slow and deliberate. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "If you stay, it's because it's your choice. Not because of guilt. Not because of what I did or didn't do." "I know," she said. "Then stay." Simple. Uncomplicated. And somehow, more powerful than anything else he could have said. She looked down at her hands, scarred and calloused now from training, from repairs, from learning how to live on her own terms. She remembered what they used to look like, delicate, unsure, always clenched in defense. Now, they rested openly on the table, unguarded. "What would I do?" she asked. "Whatever you want," he replied. She laughed under her breath. "I wouldn't even know where to start." "Then start small," he said. "Stay on the crew. Learn more systems. Take the co-pilot seat when you want. Help with contracts if you're up for it. This ship doesn't need perfection. Just presence." The word lingered in her chest, presence. She had spent so much of her life being invisible, forgotten, erased. And now here she was, being offered not just a place to hide but a place to be seen. Not as a victim, not as a lost cause, but as a person. A contributor. A decision maker. She nodded, more to herself than to him. "I'll pull my weight. I know. I'm not the same girl you bought at that auction." "I never thought you were," he said. Even then. They sat there for a long time, the stars stretching endlessly beyond the glass, the ship quiet around them. And slowly, Rhea felt something shift, not with a bang or a spark, but like a tide turning, gentle and steady. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about escape routes. She wasn't planning for betrayal. She wasn't bracing for the next fall. She was choosing. Not survival. Not safety. But a life. One she hadn't even let herself dream of before this. And in the stillness that followed, she reached for the future like she'd reached for the blade in training, not with fear, but with both hands. The stars didn't look any different now, but something inside her had changed. Rhea sat in the co-pilot's seat, legs drawn up, arms loosely wrapped around them as the Iron Raven cruised silently through open space. Derek was in the pilot's chair beside her, but his hands rested idle, the ship on autopilot. They hadn't spoken in a while, but the silence felt right. It wasn't about avoidance or tension anymore, it was just quiet. The kind you could trust. Out there, among the stars, there were still slavers. Still pirates. Still people who saw lives as numbers and currency, who would always be looking for someone to claim, to break, to use. The universe hadn't changed. It was still harsh, still vast, still indifferent. But she had changed. Not because someone saved her. Not because Derek had swooped in like some mythic hero. He wasn't that. He was flawed. He had blood on his hands and weight on his soul. He had done things, terrible things, and then chosen, one decision at a time, to be something else. And in doing so, he gave her the one thing no one ever had. A choice. Rhea had spent so long assuming that power belonged to those who controlled others. The ones with weapons, with ships, with the credits and the cruelty to keep the galaxy bending to their will. She had never questioned that structure. She had only survived beneath it. Navigated its shadows. Played by its rules. But what she'd found here, aboard this patched-up, battle-worn vessel, was something different. Power, she realized, wasn't the ability to command obedience. It wasn't about muscle or firepower or control. It was about presence. It was about saying, "I'm still here," after the world tried to erase you. It was about reaching out when you could turn away. About listening when silence is easier. About choosing to help someone who couldn't pay you back and not keeping score. And that more than any weapon, any victory, any conquest is what made humanity dangerous in the eyes of a cold galaxy. Not their ambition. Not their machines. But their refusal to stop caring. Rhea hadn't known that until Derek. And even now, he'd never said it outright. He didn't have to. He'd shown her in the spaces between words, in the coffee he poured without being asked, in the way he let her take up space without demanding she earn it. That was what made her trust him, eventually. Not because he'd redeemed himself with some noble gesture, but because he didn't pretend to be better than he was. He let her see the cracks. He let her choose to stay. And when she did, he didn't celebrate or act like she owed him anything. He just nodded, as if that choice was her right all along. She turned to look at him now. He was watching the stars too, his expression unreadable but calm. The faint light from the controls washed over his face in blue and gold. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She just studied the curve of his jaw, the silver in his hair, the lines carved deep from years of carrying things too heavy to name. "Why did you come back?" she asked suddenly. He glanced at her. "From the past." She nodded. Derek leaned back, exhaling slowly. His voice was quiet. I got tired of watching people disappear. She frowned. Disappear. People like you, he said. People who got written off as lost. Forgotten. Not worth saving. The galaxy moves fast. No one slows down long enough to ask what happens to the ones who get left behind. She studied him, feeling the truth settle into her chest. So you stopped running. I started fighting differently, he said. Not for some great cause. Not for vengeance. Just, to be the kind of man I wish had shown up sooner. She didn't respond right away. Her fingers traced the edge of the console, feeling the hum beneath it. The ship's steady rhythm had become familiar now, like breathing. That's what HFY really is, isn't it? She said softly. Derek raised an eyebrow. HFY. Humanity, fuck yeah, she said, the acronym awkward in her mouth. She'd heard it whispered in underground cells and slaver markets. Usually with bitterness. Humans were known for carving their way through the stars, for overpowering, outlasting, outgunning. The stories always framed them as relentless, unstoppable, dangerous. But that wasn't what he was. That wasn't what she'd found here. It's not about being stronger, she continued. It's not about conquering everything in sight. It's about showing up. Again and again. Even when it's hard. Even when you've failed. Derek's eyes softened. Maybe the most human thing we do, he said, is give each other the chance to change. She looked down, thinking of all the times she hadn't been given that chance. When her worth was measured in credits. When her silence was mistaken for compliance. When she was passed from one hand to another like a tool, a burden, a background figure. No one had asked her what she wanted. Until now. I don't want to be afraid anymore, she said quietly. You don't have to be. She nodded, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The Iron Raven drifted onward, through space that was still dangerous, still wild. But something had shifted inside her. She would never forget what had been done to her. She would never pretend the galaxy wasn't cruel. But now, when she looked at the stars, she didn't see escape. She saw direction. And maybe, just maybe, that's what it meant to be powerful, not because she could destroy anything that threatened her, but because she could choose to stand tall anyway. Not because someone told her she was free, but because she believed it. Not because she had been saved, but because she had saved herself. That was humanity at its most dangerous. And its most beautiful.